This is a special episode where I'm going to be revealing 8 unique and original logical proofs for God that I have constructed. I made an exhaustive study of every major proof of God. I read through various books of proofs of God, listened to various theologians, compiled all those, and I've critiqued and analyzed those in a few previous episodes. But I found all of those to be lacking, and I found them to be weak. And of course, based on my own direct experience of God, I decided to come up with better ones. And as the saying goes, if you want something done right, do it yourself. So that's what I did. I constructed these proofs. There's 8 of them. We're going to go through all of these and explain to you how all this stuff works. These are proofs based on hundreds of my own personal awakenings and contemplations into the nature of God, direct consciousness of the logical structure of God. This is not speculation. This is not a belief system that I adopted. This is not an ideology of any kind. I'm not a Christian. I'm not a Jew. I'm not a Muslim. None of that stuff. I'm not a New Ager. This is grounded. This is a grounded empirical exploration of God. So this is something that human beings rarely consider as possible, is that you don't need to believe in God. If God is real, you can have consciousness of it, and you can have an empirical exploration of God in the same way that you can scientifically explore any aspect of reality. You can empirically study black holes, you can empirically study the sun, you can empirically study different animals on various planets, and likewise you can do with God. This isn't so crazy. It's really not. Scientists make this out to be like some sort of, it's some sort of woo stuff. Like, no. You can be conscious of something, and then you can sit in the same way that a scientist can sit and, a theoretical physicist can sit and think through the logical consequences of the mathematics of a black hole. For example, if the gravity is such and such, and the electromagnetic field is such and such, and radiation and information works in such and such a way, then what are the consequences for black holes? That's what Stephen Hawking did. And then he came up with real conclusions about black holes, even before black holes were found through telescopes. He was able to deduct through logical analysis consequences of what a black hole would mean. And he came up with the idea that black holes must radiate even though they absorb everything, but they must also, because of the logical consequences of conservation of energy and information and thermodynamic principles and all this complicated stuff, that black holes must have radiation, and turns out that they do. It's called Hawking radiation. So the exact same thing can be done with God. It's just that God is not quite as easily accessible as a black hole is. Because God is so fundamental that we're talking about the very fabric of existence, more fundamental than a black hole. Okay, but before I get into that, I'm already getting too excited about it. Let me issue some warnings here. We're going to get real deep into all this interesting logical stuff here in a minute. Okay, so a few warnings. Proofs and logic here are retrospective. I am not claiming that you can use the logic that I'm going to be telling you here to reach God or to conclude that God exists. It cannot work this way. So even though I'm going to describe the logic of God to you, from your point of view, that doesn't prove God, because whether the logical conclusions are actually empirically correlate to anything out in the real world, you're not going to know that. In order to have that understanding, you're going to have your own awakening, right? There is no way for you to know that God exists other than through awakening. That's the only way. Aside from that, all you have are just speculations, conclusions, theories, and beliefs. These are the only possibilities. So God is not a logical conclusion. It's not that I sat down and I had a belief in God, and then I said to myself, okay, well, how can I rationalize it to myself and make it sound kind of scientific? No, that's not what happened here. And it's not the case that I was sitting there and thinking through the logic and then one day like, okay, the logic tells me that God must exist, therefore God exists. Nope, that's not how it worked. I had awakening after awakening after awakening, literally over 100 awakenings before I even started to think about the logical structure of God. that somehow logic might play into why God is the way that it is. And then I had hundreds of awakenings beyond that, over 200 awakenings. And there I really started to figure out the actual logic of it. In each of those awakenings, I did my empirical exploration. Now, of course, be careful with this notion of empirical exploration, because science limits what is considered empirical exploration to a very limited domain. We need to expand what that really means. Empiricism doesn't just apply to objects in the physical world. It also applies to abstract entities, such as what mathematicians do. So mathematicians, when they think about mathematical theorems, proofs, axiomatic systems, various kinds of theorems and so forth, and discoveries within mathematics, what are they doing? They're exploring the logic of their own mind, basically. But it's more than just exploring the logic of their own personal mind. It's not like it's all just subjective and anything goes. They're exploring the mechanics of mind in general. Now, of course, mathematicians think that they're not exploring mind. They think they're exploring reality. They're exploring mind. More on that later. Because all there is just mind. Everything you're doing is you're exploring mind. All scientists are just exploring mind. So science can be done on external objects like black holes and stars and animals. Science can be done on internal psychology. You can do a science of your own internal emotions, motivations, shadow stuff, material trauma that you have. That's also science. You know, if you were abused as a child and you repress that, and then you do inner work to figure out that, there was that repressed memory of abuse, and you bring that forth in a sort of therapeutic setting, that is a kind of science that you're doing on yourself. That's empirical, right? Because you're observing stuff that happened to you. Maybe you're fooling yourself, maybe you're not. Well, the same thing can be done with God. So don't make this mistake of thinking that you can't do empirical work on abstract entities. God is quite abstract, so of course we're dealing with gross abstractions here. And then on the other hand, it's also extremely grounded as well. It's not just theoretical. So also another warning here is that just because the logic of these proofs is valid doesn't mean that it will persuade anyone. The mind's capacity for doubt is infinite. You can doubt anything. You can doubt math. You can doubt logic. You can doubt black holes exist. You can doubt anything. There's no limit to what you can doubt. You have the ability to deny anything. Anything that is said to you that you don't like for whatever personal reasons, whatever biases you have, you can doubt it. And so I expect people to doubt the things that I say here. And there's nothing, your doubt is independent from the truth or validity of anything I say, because your doubt is about you. It's your stuff. Notice that. Another warning is that I don't expect any of these proofs to convince an atheist, a materialist, a scientist, or a skeptic, again, for the reason that I just mentioned. Because these people have their own agenda, their own paradigm that they are trying to stick to, and they're not going to like the conclusions of the logic that I present here, so they're going to have their own logic, right? And you can have a battle of logics. People can have different logical systems that they use, and then who decides which logical system is correct? See, there's no one absolute logical system. You can't just appeal to logic to determine what is true and what is false, because logic can be used in any which ways. You can twist logic any which way you want to prove almost anything you want. And nor do I care about proving God to these sorts of people, because it's just not possible. And then the other warning is that tautology is going to come up here, and tautology is often assumed to be a problem, as though it's circular reasoning. But consider that when we're talking about something so fundamental as the very basis of existence itself, that's God, the very basis of existence, tautology here should not be assumed as just a bug. It's a feature. God's existence, or the existence of reality is God. The existence of reality is a metaphysical tautology. Reality has to exist. It must exist. So whatever logical deductions you're going to do, whatever logical analysis through science, mathematics, theology, anything, philosophy, in the end, all of your logical work will come down and culminate in an explanation of why things are exactly the way they are and not any other way. Because the way reality is absolutely how it is, and it can't be any other way. The trick, though, in doing this work is trying to get some insight into why it is the way that it is and not some other way. And so that will be explained here through this work. You might say then, well, Leo, if logic can't get me to God, then what's the point of talking about this? Well, there is a point, because God has a logical structure. And even though thinking about the logic probably will not lead to an awakening for you, it also might. You never want to exclude the possibility that you could have an awakening just listening to me talking. That's possible. Not very likely, though. But see, awakening is not the only thing that we're after here. What we're after is an understanding of this logical structure. This is important to understand. And this understanding, don't assume that it'll just come to you automatically through your awakening. Like one day you're just going to have an awakening and then, you're all done. You understand everything. God is crystal clear to you. And then you move on with life. This is a fantasy. This is not how it works. What happens is that you have one awakening and then you're blasted by God and then you're kind of shocked and awed and you don't know what the hell that was. Like, what the hell was that? That's like your first awakening. You don't even know that it's God yet. It's just something like mysterious and powerful and like, whoa, that was crazy. And then it's gone. But you know there was something real there. So you pursue, and then maybe 6 months later you have another awakening. It's like, boom, oh, okay, wow. Now it's even deeper. Now I see a little bit more clearly. Now I know God exists for sure. Okay, good. And then you have another awakening, and now it's like, boom, oh, not only does God exist, but I'm God. Oh, okay, wow. That's a little extra facet that that's a connection that I didn't see in my first two awakenings. And then this keeps going and going and going. There's many facets to these awakenings, many degrees to these different facets, and they all start to combine together. And then you start to notice that there's a kind of a logical structure. There's reason behind how it works. It's not just arbitrary. And so understanding this logic will help you to deepen your awakenings. That's why this is important and why this is practical. And it's not just purely theoretical. And it's not enough for you to encounter God or to experience God and to know that God exists or to even know that you are God. None of that is enough. You have to comprehend what God is, why God is, how it came to be, the logic of it. And then there's an additional layer, which is that as you have your awakenings, whether through meditation or through self-inquiry or through psychedelics, there's going to be integration work. Let's say you have an awakening to God on a psychedelic, then you need to come back and you need to think about it, process it, because it's not going to be clear to you exactly what happened. You're going to have to mull it over for hours and days and weeks and months. And then by thinking about it, you're going to start to notice like, oh, okay, that's what happened. And that's why that happened. Oh, and I see this connects with that. And this thing I read in that book about God, that connects. And see, you're doing this connection work. And you don't have time to do this connection work when you're in the middle of your awakening because it's too shocking, too fast. And the integration work takes months. So understanding this logic will help you with your integration work and take you deeper. Connect you deeper to existence. And it's just profound to think about these things. Very profound. So what I'm going to be presenting here, even though I'm calling them proofs, this is a little bit tongue-in-cheek. Really what they are is post hoc descriptions of the ultimate structure of existence. This explains how anything at all could exist. This logic accounts for how to create anything and everything from nothing. It answers the question of why there's something rather than nothing, which is sort of like the ultimate existential question. It also explains the nature of God and some of God's properties, like God is love. Why is God love? What is the logic of that? Is that just some hippie saying? Am I just saying God is love because I want it to be that way? No, of course not. It's because the logic leads there. And it explains other properties of and features of God, such as omnipotence, omniscience, intelligence, beauty, goodness, perfection. These are all classic properties of God. So these proofs help to explain why God has these properties and where they come from and how they could be possible. Because all of these properties seem like they're these magical, too good to be true qualities that no object in the universe is supposed to have, right? No object is supposed to be omnipotent or omniscient. So how is that possible? Well, we're going to explain that. Because love and omnipotence are actually consequences of logic. All of God's properties are necessary logical consequences of the ontology of infinity. God is infinity. So really, all of these proofs are really proofs of infinity. But the infinity that I'm talking about is not the infinity of mathematics. The infinity of mathematics is just a small part of absolute infinity of God. We'll talk more about that as we go deeper into the notion of infinity. But there's a very good reason for why God has the properties that it has, and it's profound to understand those reasons. So without further ado, let's get into these proofs. There's 8 of them, so I'm just going to give you the titles of them first. These are just titles I invented. The first one is the logic of oneness. The second is the logic of distinction. The third is argument from numerical infinity. The fourth is argument from infinite division. Fifth is the logic of self-creation. Sixth, the logic of limits. Seventh, argument from control. And eighth, the impossibility of finite objects. So now let's get into each one. First is the logic of oneness. So follow along with me here. There's many steps in these arguments. Follow along with each one. I'm going to pause at various points and explain, connect dots for you. Okay, so here's the first step. The logic of oneness. There are only 2 possibilities. Either reality is one or it is not one. Now, as I'm explaining each point, you can pause. I encourage you to pause the recording and think about it. Think about, is what I'm saying true? Think of counterpoints. Think of counter-arguments. Don't just accept what I'm saying. Really engage with this material. Get traction with your mind. Raise objections. That's all necessary and important. So, either reality is one or it is not one. If reality is one, my claim is that it must be God. Now, that's a radical claim because it's hard to see how do you get from one to God. That seems like a huge leap. My claim is that anything that is one must be God. Why? Because, again, now think of the logic of what it means for reality to be one versus multiple. If reality is one, what does that mean? It means that there is no other to reality. There's only reality. That means if it's one, there's nothing relative to it that you can compare it or contrast it against. So, of course, now you're wondering, well, Leo, how do you know that there's only one reality? What if there's multiple realities and you just don't see the other ones? Okay, that's a good question. We're going to explain that here, right? Let's keep going. Again, look, I said if reality is one, right? So I'm not making the claim that it is one yet. I'm just saying if it is. So if it is one, that means that it has no other, because other requires something other to reality. But what would that be? Try to imagine something other than reality. What would that be? Now, here's an interesting thought experiment. Is that even possible? Be careful assuming that it is possible, because it might not be possible that there is anything other than reality. Okay, let's continue with the logic. Now, just assuming that there is only one reality, that means that there's nothing other. That which has no other has nothing to limit it. Because imagine an object that's just a singular object. Just a singular object exists. This object has no other. It doesn't even have a sort of a backdrop Because usually when you think of an object, you think of an object and then the backdrop from which that object is distinct. But in this case, when we're talking about one, see, the object and the backdrop are both included in the oneness. So see, if you think that there's an object and a backdrop, now there's two. There's the object, there's something other to the object, which is the thing that is not the object, which is the backdrop, the background. But we can use our mind to combine the two objects into a single entity, the object plus the backdrop. Now that whole system is a singular one thing. And then that system, we might just imagine that maybe it has an other, but maybe it doesn't have an other. If it doesn't have an other, then what could limit this system? You see, any limit to this system has to be part of the system. But then if the limit is part of the system, that means the system is in control or has dominion over its own limits. What does that mean? That means logically that the system is unlimited. So the ontology of the notion of oneness equates with absolute sovereignty. Any object that exists as one must have absolute sovereignty over itself. Why? Because what would divide its sovereignty? If you say that there's a single object, but it's not sovereign, okay, well then there must be some other thing that is sovereign over it. But that other thing is a two, it's not a one. And now if we take that other thing and we include it with the first thing, if we take two things and we combine them into one using our mind, then now that system, we could call that a one, and now that system must have sovereignty. Now you could say, well, there's a third thing. Okay, well, let's combine the first two and the third into a one. And then now that has sovereignty and say, well, there's a fourth thing. Okay, well, let's combine the fourth thing again into a one. And what you see here is that this operation of oneness, this isn't just something you're doing with your mind, as it might seem, some conceptual activity. What you need to notice is that this is actually baked into the very fabric of existence. This notion of one. You can always lump things together into a absolute oneness. And as soon as you do that, that absolute oneness becomes absolute sovereign. And that leads to God. Now look, you might say, well, Leo, okay, fine, but you said if is one, but how do we know it's one? Well, because anything you imagine that is other than one, we can just incorporate it into the one. Nothing is stopping us from incorporating it. So if you imagine that there are two realities, we can just take the first reality and the second reality and regard them both as one reality. So you see, your consciousness is actually playing a fundamental role here, because the way that you're looking at parts of reality, the way you're subdividing reality with your consciousness actually determines whether it's a one or a two or a three. And as you subdivide reality into parts, each part loses a part of its sovereignty. Because absolute sovereignty is only when you take the totality of all the parts. As soon as you have a fraction of the totality, now it can't be absolutely sovereign. Now some other part can have control or sovereignty over it. Now, if you want to say that reality is not one, look at how this works. This is interesting. That means, what would make reality not one? Something must be dividing reality. There must be a boundary, a border, a gap. Something has to divide one reality from another part of reality, or a totally different reality. So if you're imagining in your mind's eye reality number one, reality number two, and reality number three, what makes them three different realities? Why don't you just call them one reality with three pieces? Of course, it's a matter of your perspective. It's a matter of how you look at it. And what is separating these three realities? A vacuum, emptiness, nothingness, space, a wall, a brick wall. But notice that if reality is not one, something must be dividing it. Now, that division itself, is that division real or unreal? It can only be one of the or the other. If the division is unreal, then reality has not been divided, and therefore it is still one. Because how can you divide reality with something that's not real? This is the tautology. Again, the tautology here is not a mistake. This is absolutely fundamental. By ontological tautology, you cannot divide a real thing with an unreal thing. You get that? Well, what if the division is actually real? Well, that also doesn't work, because if the division is real, then all parts of reality, including the division between the parts, are real, in which case all of them are united together into one by their realness. So try to follow this logic. If you have reality 1 and you have reality 2, and you say that there is a real brick wall between them that separates them, okay, but then this is real, and this is real, and the wall is real, therefore all of it is real. If everything that we're talking about is real, then it's one. It's one real thing. Now, if you say, well, no, Leo, the wall, let's change it. Let's say the wall is unreal. What if we have a real thing here and a real thing here, and then we have an unreal thing dividing them? But an unreal thing isn't real, therefore it can't divide them. So you also have just one reality. So no matter how you slice it, you can only have one reality. This is the logic of reality. This is not my logic that I invented. This is literally the fabric of space-time works this way. All real things are part of the unity of realness. The real division of the real is real. Therefore, it is absolutely impossible to divide reality. Because anything you would divide it with would be real and would unite all parts of reality. That's the genius of it. Anything that divides reality unites reality. This sounds like a contradiction, but think it through. It really is true. How are you going to split reality? Are you going to take a giant knife and cut it down the middle? But if you cut the knife down the middle of reality, the knife itself has to be real. Or what? It's not real. It's not a real knife. But if you don't have a real knife, then you can't cut reality. So to cut reality, you need a real knife. But a real knife doesn't cut reality. It just unites reality. And what is the cut actually made out of? Because let's say you actually cut space-time. Okay, but then what's in the middle between space-time? Nothingness? Well, then nothingness is real. If nothingness is not real, then nothingness is not separating space-time, two parts of space-time. But if nothingness is real, then nothingness is connecting two parts of space-time. See? So you can't get away from this issue. It's absolutely tautological. So therefore, reality is one. So here's my homework assignment for you. Sit down and try to imagine a way to create more than one reality. And think through the logic of that. How could there be more than one reality? And notice that it's absolutely impossible for you to imagine how there could be more than one reality. You can't do it. Notice that. And so therefore, God exists. Why does God exist? Because God is reality, and reality is one. Well, you say, well, Leo, but this seems like you're smuggling God in here. Maybe I even agree with you that reality is one, but how do you get from one to God? Again, because if you have one, there's no other. If there is no other, that means there's no limit, nothing other to limit you. That means you're unlimited. If you're unlimited, that means you have complete sovereignty over yourself. What is it that has complete sovereignty over itself? God. Infinite power. Omnipotence. Reality is omnipotent in the sense that reality can be any which way it wants to be. Nothing is stopping reality from being however it wants to be because reality is the only thing that exists. So who could tell reality otherwise? From the scientifically minded point of view, this seems silly. And the reason it seems silly is because you're used to dealing and just taking for granted physical laws. Usually we think of reality as being very limited. It's like, Leo, you're saying reality is unlimited, but reality is so limited. We're so constrained by physical laws. There's so many things we can't do. We're bound by physics and thermodynamics and this and logic, and we're bound by all these different things. Yes, you are, because you're deep within reality. You're a little ant within reality. So yes, it seems like you're bound by it. But this is only a local phenomena. The physical laws themselves, what is actually instantiating and holding the physical laws steady and not allowing them to change? Is it something outside of reality? No, it can't be something outside of reality because something outside of reality isn't real by definition, tautologically. Therefore, anything outside of reality couldn't have any effect on reality itself because it isn't real. That means that reality is imposing these laws on itself. That means nothing is stopping reality from changing the laws. Now you might say, well, Leo, why doesn't reality change the laws? Well, first of all, it does, and it can. But second of all, because we need to maintain your sanity. See, the physical laws, what you call the physical laws, are deeply tied in with your sense of sanity. If they changed right now, you would lose your sense of sanity. You'd go insane. So that's why they can't change. They can change. It's just that if they did change, you would be in a mental asylum. And there are many people in mental asylums, millions of such people around the world. So it does change. It's just that you haven't experienced it personally. And if you did, you would be so horrified, you would take antipsychotic medications to get your physical laws back, to get your sanity back. See, if all the physical laws, literally think through the consequences of your objections. Because when you're saying, well, Leo, if you claim that reality is unlimited and the physical laws can just change, then why doesn't God just give me $1 billion? Think through the silliness of some of your objections here, right? If God just showered you with $1 billion, again, you have to think about the consistency of reality. Reality, the whole trick to reality is that it has to maintain consistency. If one day you think you have $1 billion, the next day there isn't $1 billion, you're going to start to think you're losing your mind. Because, you woke up this morning, you checked your bank account, there's $1 billion. Oh my God, you're so happy and thrilled. And then the next day you log into your bank account and you see that you've lost $1 billion. And now you're freaking out and you're panicking and you're thinking, did I just dream that? Did I hallucinate having $1 billion yesterday? And now it's all gone, and now I even owe an extra $1 billion, so now I'm down $2 billion. You're losing your mind, you're freaking out. This is leading towards insanity. And this is just $1 billion, but now think about what would happen if the walls of your house started to change. What would happen if you went to sleep today, and then you woke up not in the place you went to sleep, but you woke up in a different country, on another planet? You would think you lost your mind, because you couldn't make sense of what happened to you. How is it possible that I went to sleep today on Earth and then I woke up on another planet? You would think, did aliens kidnap me? Was this all a Matrix simulation? What happened? And then your mind would be scrambling and you couldn't figure it out. And then eventually you might conclude that you just had a psychotic episode, especially if this didn't happen once, but it kept happening. Like, every time you went to bed, you woke up on a different planet. You would think you lost your mind. So the point is that nothing is stopping reality from changing its physical laws completely. In fact, this happens when you're asleep in your dreams. Nothing is stopping that from happening, which is why your dreams are so wacky and crazy. But for human life to flourish, there needs to be a sense of consistency. So this is being done for your sake. God is maintaining these boundaries for your sake. That doesn't, but then the mistake that scientists make is they think, well, that means that there is no God because reality is so constrained. No, reality is unlimited. It has no constraints. But for there to be a human life that takes place over 100 years with consistency, where you can talk to other people, you can collaborate with them, and you're not all talking against each other, past each other, there needs to be a common frame of reference, a common sense of reality, a common sense of law. Just like in a society, people need laws in order for there to be a coherent society. Otherwise, you're going to have complete anarchy. If anybody can just do whatever they want, if laws change from night and day, willy-nilly. And so it is with physics as well. There can be many different kinds of physics. We happen to be in this particular kind of physics because this is just conducive to a human life. So even a division between one reality and multiple realities is not a division because all of it is one reality. Reality is an absolute. So when I talk about absolutes, see, an absolute must be tautological. That means no matter which way you slice it, no matter how you look at it, no matter if there's one of it or two of it or three of it or four of it or infinite of it, it must all come to the same conclusion, which is oneness. All numbers, you can think of it this way, the number line 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, infinity, up to infinity. All of the numbers, you might think, well, there's so many numbers, there's infinite of them. Yes, but on the other hand, there's only one collection of numbers. All the numbers, just one, we call them numbers. It's one thing, numbers. Now I say, well, but there's also imaginary numbers and transcendental numbers and irrational numbers and rational numbers and so forth. Yes, but we can take all of those and still just lump them together and say, there's just one thing, numbers. In mathematics, it's all just one thing, numbers, different kinds of numbers. We can lump them all together into one set. So another way to think about this is set theory. What is set theory? It's really the foundation of mathematics. Set theory is just collections of objects, which is how numbers are often defined within mathematics and philosophy of math. A number is just a set of things, we might say. But then what is the set of all possible sets? That would be one set. The set of all possible sets. That's the infinite set. That's absolute infinity. That's God. So notice that in set theory, there must be a set that contains all the sets. That's God. Now, there's interesting paradoxes within set theory, so don't think I don't understand about those. I'm just not going to go into that because it gets kind of hairy and complicated, and I've talked about that in my Gödel's and completeness theorem episodes. So if you want that, check out my episode called Understanding the Implications of Gödel's and Completeness Theorems. I'm not going to go into that here too much, but yes, there are very interesting paradoxes within set theory, and also there are many interesting paradoxes within infinities, Gary Cantor's infinities. I have an episode called Understanding Infinity Part 1 and Part 2 where I talk a lot about various interesting ramifications and paradoxes of infinity. So I'm not going to go into that too much here, but just we're connecting some of those old episodes with this new discussion here. So as it turns out, absolute unity is the only thing that can exist by logical tautology. And unity must be omnipotent. And also now here comes the love. Unity is love. What is love? Love is not an emotion humans feel. Love is an ontological condition. It's the ontological condition of unity. When everything is ontologically united together, that is metaphysical love, of which the emotion of the human emotion of romantic love and so forth, this is a little hair growing on the ass of the ox, so to speak. It's just a little manifestation of ontological unity. So why is love unity? Because love, yes, it's a human emotion, but the emotion, what causes the emotion of human love to arise? The emotion of human love arises when you feel a profound connection to some part of reality that is other than yourself. A child, a lover, an intimate romantic lover, or if you love mankind, or if you love an animal, a dog or something, or a cat. So see, when you love your dog, you feel a connection, a bond to your dog. If you look at some other dog that's not yours, you don't love it. You're not connected to it. But when you love your dog, you're connected to your dog, and then the deeper the love grows, the more you feel at one with your dog. Psychologically, at first it starts as a psychological thing. You start to psychologically connect and get closer. Then there's also a physical connection. You literally hug your dog, pet your dog, sleep with your dog. Hopefully you don't fuck your dog, but you could if you wanted to go that far. Not that I recommend this sort of thing. But, in the case of humans, when at first, on a first date, what happens? You look into each other's eyes, and then there's a psychological connection there's a bond through the eyes that's being formed in a romance. Then it goes closer. Now you start touching, getting physically closer. Then you start kissing. Then you start rubbing and making out and all this sorts of stuff. Then eventually, what happens? You try to get as close as possible to the thing that you love, to the beloved. You get closer to the object. Literally, when you're in love with something, you want to merge into it, which you do with sex. But even that is not the deepest level of union, of love, because at that point, you're in there as deep as you can go. You're balls deep, right? But then the literal physics of sex limit how deep you can go and how completely you can merge into the other person. Because even though you can penetrate physically, you can't quite penetrate psychologically. You can't quite look through the eyes of the other person. You can't literally become them. See, if you really loved somebody, you wouldn't just love them from a distance. You would want to literally become them and physically become identical to them. This physical identification is impossible within the physical world because the physical world is made of physical distinctions. These distinctions are literally what your body is made out of. The reason you're not the same as the wall of your house is because there's a distinction between you and the wall. And then if you wanted to, in a sense, make love to your house, you would need to merge into the wall, melt into the wall. This sounds kind of silly, and you might think this is impossible, but it actually is possible. You could melt into the wall of your house. You could literally become your house. Now, if you became your house, that would be a profound mystical experience, and that would be an example of metaphysical love. But this love goes higher and deeper because eventually, where is all of this leading to? You keep getting closer and closer and closer until eventually you become identical to the beloved. The lover becomes identical to the beloved. When this happens, there is literally no more difference between you and what you love. And so, when all things in reality become identical to each other, when all of the divisions melt, when the oneness and unity of all things is realized, that is absolute, infinite, ontological love. That's God. That's why God is love. Now, moving on. Actually, before we move on to the next proof, a few more details here. See, again, you cannot divide God because any division of God would have to be done using God. God is all divisions. So to divide God, you would need to use God to divide God. If you took a knife and you cut God in half, God is everything. Since God is everything, God is the thing you're cutting, but it's also the knife. So you're cutting God with God. You can't cut God with God. God is existence. To divide God, you would need to divide existence. but you cannot divide existence because the thing you're dividing existence with needs to exist. If it exists, if you're dividing existence by existence, you didn't divide it, you just have more existence. Every division that tries to divide God unites God. This is why God is unity, absolute unity. God is infinite self-division, but these divisions are not permanent. These are temporary, illusory divisions. God is ultimately indivisible because even though you're dividing God, right? Like God can divide itself by creating a Leo and creating a you. You're sitting there watching a Leo here. There's air and space in between. We're in different countries, different parts of the world, different states, whatever. We're separated in time and space through video and so forth and audio. It seems like Leo is divided from you, but really Leo is connected to you because the only reason you can hear me and see me and feel me and experience me and be conscious of me is because I literally am you. So even though it seems like I'm divided from you, I'm actually united with you. Now, I could be more united with you. If we had sex, we would be more united. And if we had a deep, 20-year marriage, we would be even more united. Maybe divided, maybe we'd get divorced. But, assuming it worked out, we would be even more united. And if we had a profound mystical psychedelic experience, we could merge our minds together telepathically. And then beyond that, if you and I both died together, literally you and I would merge into a pure metaphysical nothingness, which is the pinnacle of love, which is why love is ultimately nothing. The reason love is nothing is because nothing is the highest form of unity, because somethingness is distinction, and these distinctions, any kind of form or somethingness actually creates a subtle separation, a subtle distance. If you want to close the gap between all forms, you need to collapse them all down into absolute formlessness, and then you'd have absolute unity, absolute nothingness, and that would be infinity, absolute pure infinity. That would be God, the source of all existence. All right, moving on to the next proof. This one is called the logic of distinction. So it touches upon, look, all these proofs are going to interconnect here in a beautiful way. So they all reinforce each other. This is going to build on top of the stuff we were just talking about with distinction. So look how this works. Anything at all that exists is a distinction. Anything. There is nothing you can think of that is not a distinction. Even not a distinction is a distinction because you're distinguishing it from a distinction. This is very profound. The difference between something and nothing is a distinction. The difference between existence and non-existence is a distinction. The difference between limited and unlimited is a distinction. The difference between possible and impossible is a distinction. The difference between real and imaginary is a distinction. The difference between one and many is a distinction. The difference between all possible starting states of reality is just more distinctions. So think about it. If you're thinking scientifically about where did the Big Bang come from, where did the universe come from, you might think, well, why is the universe this way and not some other way? When you're thinking that way, you need to notice that these are distinctions that you're making. If the universe was this way, or that way, or a third way, or a fifth way, all of those are distinctions. Distinctions are held within a mind. Distinctions are not just conceptual things. Distinctions are also physical things. So even the difference between conceptual and physical is a distinction. All of these distinctions ultimately are collapsible. There is no such thing as an absolute distinction because that would be a limit upon reality. Reality is unlimited. So these distinctions, they can come and go. You can imagine them however you want. And then that creates different kinds of realities. So what you need to realize, if you're asking, like, where did the Big Bang come from? What you need to realize is that you think like, well, reality surely had some sort of beginning state. It had to start some way, right? It had to be some way. And then whichever way it was, what's the reason for it being that way and not some other way? That's sort of this gets to the question of, how do you get something from nothing? But the issue is more profound than you're even realizing yet, than you're appreciating, because what I'd like you to see is that the difference between any possible starting state and even the idea that there is a starting state, that reality had a start, that idea itself is a distinction. So what happens when you collapse all the distinctions? What you get is pure indistinctness or pure nothingness. It is therefore impossible to maintain any finite, limited starting state of reality, since the distinction between it and everything else collapses. So in a sense, there was no start to reality. Why not? Because start, beginning, is a distinction. Reality didn't just one day come into existence. Why not? Because come into existence and even reality is a distinction. Even the difference between finite and infinite is a distinction. The collapse of every single distinction is absolute unity, absolute infinity, nothingness. This is God. This collapse of all distinctions, this infinity is God. Nothing is the source of everything. Nothing isn't just the source. It's not that everything came out of nothing. It's that nothing is indistinguishable from everything. You kind of like, the scientist thinks that, well, something came out of nothing. So there was nothing and then something arose. No. There was nothing, and there was no distinction or difference between that nothing and something and everything. And therefore, you are inside of this nothing, something, everything at all times. God is the entire possibility space of all distinctions. This is not the same thing as the multiverse. It's more profound than the multiverse. Because the multiverse still assumes various kinds of distinctions. The multiverse distinguishes itself from the universe. The multiverse is not profound enough to be true. And the multiverse doesn't recognize that what we're talking about here is not just an object, we're talking about God. We're talking about unity, we're talking about ontological love. Ontological love is the absence of all distinction. God is ontological love. God, or mind with a capital M, is the unlimited ability to imagine all possible distinctions. That's what God is. It's an infinite mind. The reason I'm calling it God and not just reality or something like nothing is because it's an infinite mind. It's conscious. It's sentient. Now you might say, well, Leo, how does nothingness become conscious and sentient? That's already wrong. Nothingness, because it is absolutely true, is self-conscious, self-aware. Consciousness is absolute truth. This is too profound. You're not going to understand it, so I'm not going to even explain it. It's just too profound. I would need a whole separate episode just to explain this part. It's too profound. So I'm just skipping over this, kind of glossing over it here. But the reason that anything at all exists or is possible is because there's no difference between possible and impossible, and there's no difference between anything, everything, and nothing. And therefore, from this ontological condition or fact, it's an absolute fact. From this absolute condition, what you get is physical reality. It's a precipitate. Physical reality, what humans call physical reality, is a precipitate of the ontological condition of there not being a distinction between absolutely anything. So you might wonder, how does God create stuff? The way God creates stuff is by imagining distinctions. So if God wants to create a chicken, what does God do? Does God need to go into a factory and build a chicken? No. Does he need to go into a laboratory and muck around with DNA to synthesize a chicken? No. Does God need a mother hen to hatch an egg to create a chicken? No. All God needs to do is to imagine the distinction of a chicken. That's what a chicken is. A chicken is a distinction. And what kind of distinction is it? It's chicken. A chicken is exactly the distinction of chicken. And then what about a kangaroo? Well, a kangaroo is another distinction, which is exactly a kangaroo. So what distinguishes a chicken from a kangaroo? Well, it's only your consciousness. So believe it or not, ordinarily, a scientist would say, well, there's an absolute distinction between a chicken and a kangaroo. There's an object called a chicken, and there's an object called a kangaroo, and these are different objects. No, this is just a conception within consciousness. So what the scientist doesn't understand is that the distinction between a chicken and a kangaroo, you can collapse this distinction, and then literally a chicken and a kangaroo will merge together into an absolute unity, which is just a formless nothingness. So in this way, a chicken and a kangaroo can become identical. When a chicken and a kangaroo become metaphysically identical, that's love. That's the highest form of love. So the reason that this thing we're talking about now is unlimited is because notice that every limit to reality is a distinction. Where would these distinctions come from? A distinction doesn't just exist. A distinction has to be imagined by a mind. To say that a distinction is imagined by a mind is simply to say that a distinction appears out of nothing, because a mind is just nothing. You might think, well, a mind has a brain. No, a mind does not have a brain, does not need a brain. When I talk about mind, I'm talking about nothing. The nature of mind is absolute nothing. So what mind really is forget about psychology, forget about brains, forget about science. That's all horseshit. A mind, truly, ontologically, what is a mind? A mind is just an infinite field of nothing that spontaneously precipitates distinctions. Chickens, kangaroos, Earth, the Big Bang, these are all distinctions. And these distinctions can be limits. For example, gravity, this is a distinction, and it's also a limit. These distinctions and limits can come and go, but the underlying infinite field, God, is unlimited because it's imagining all the distinctions. And so, since it's doing this, it has infinite power. Anything that this infinite mind can imagine can be materialized, which is how you get Earth, the sun, the stars, kangaroos, chickens, etc., etc. Okay, moving on to the next proof, which is called the logic of limits. Okay, follow along. First, there are only three possibilities. One is that initially nothing exists. If nothing exists, then notice that no limits exist either, since a limit is something. Therefore, if nothing exists, reality is unlimited. If reality is unlimited, reality is God. Okay, option number two is that initially something exists, and this thing is not a limit upon reality. If it's not a limit, therefore reality is unlimited by definition. Okay. Possibility number three is that initially something exists and it is a limit upon reality. Only in this third possibility is reality not unlimited. In other words, it's limited. So for reality to be limited, there must exist a thing that is a limit upon reality. Okay, so now let's go deeper with this. If such a limit exists, it is either undoable or not. What do I mean by undoable? Here's what I mean. For example, you in your life can set a rule for yourself. You can set a rule that you will never again drink alcohol. You can set that rule, but what's the problem with setting such kinds of rules? If you're a self-help junkie, you've set all sorts of rules for yourself in your life. And even if you're not, you have. But then what's the problem with setting such rules? Of course, you break them the next day, don't you? See, in this case, you want to limit yourself. You want to be able to say, no more alcohol. I am prohibiting myself from ever touching alcohol. But then the next day, you break that limit. Now, here's an interesting thought experiment. Could you set a limit upon yourself that you could not undo? Is there anything you could do in your life such that you could create a limit that you will never touch alcohol and you literally would be physically impossible for you to touch alcohol? That's difficult to imagine that scenario. It's practically impossible for a human to do that. Because no matter what limit you would set, like let's say you lock yourself in a cage. Let's say you build a prison cage for yourself. You lock yourself inside, you take the key and you throw it away. So now how do you get out? You can't physically touch alcohol. Okay, but eventually through your cleverness or brute strength, you might be able to bend the bars of that prison cell breakout, and if you broke out, you'd be able to touch alcohol again. And you could play around with these different thought experiments but the gist of this is that in your own life that it's impossible for you to set a limit upon yourself that you can't break. So here's the problem with limits, is that he who sets the limit can undo the limit. The only way that you can't undo the limit is if the limit is not imposed on you by yourself, but imposed on you by some other to you. That's the key. Do you see where I'm going with this? That keyword other? Look at how profound this gets. The only reason you won't be able to touch alcohol if you lock yourself into a prison cell of your own design is because now the prison cell has become other to you, and the prison cell is constraining you. Now, just kind of imagine in a silly way that what if you were the prison cell and you had control and autonomy over yourself? You could just unlock the door for yourself. See? So literally, for you to impose a limit upon yourself, you have to put it outside of your own sovereignty and control. Now, in the finite human world, this is possible. You can hire some guards that stand outside your prison door, and they are distinct enough from you, and they have their own sort of sense of self and mind, their own ego, and you can't control their minds with your mind telepathically and so forth because of these various physical limits. It is possible for you to design a situation where you get locked into a prison with guards outside on the moon and there's no alcohol there. That's possible. But the problem is that this is not possible for reality as a whole, for God as a whole. So let's look at this. So now you understand what I meant by a limit existing that is either undoable or not undoable. If the limit is undoable, like in the case where you're just walking around drinking alcohol, you can always undo your own, rules for yourself. In that case, if a thing exists that is a limit and the limit is undoable, then reality can just undo that limit. Well, if the limit is undoable, then it's not really limiting reality. It's only temporary. Therefore, it's not really a limit. It can always be undone. Therefore, reality must be unlimited. Therefore, infinite. Therefore, God. So the only way that is possible for God not to exist is if there exists some limit that cannot be undone by reality. Only then could there not be a God, because there would then only be a limited reality. Now, let's explore whether that's actually possible. It seems possible, but we're going to discover that it's not. Look at the logic of this. What would it mean to have a limit that is not undoable? The only way there could be a limit that is not undoable is if there is some other limit outside the first limit. There needs to be a second limit that prevents the first limit from being undone. But then what prevents the second limit from being undone? Because if the second limit is undoable and you undo that, then the first limit becomes also undoable because you've undone the limit that prevented you from undoing the first limit. You see? It's sort of like you have a set of locked containers, and each smaller container is contained in a bigger container, and you have this chain of containers. If you want to unlock the one inside, you have to unlock from the outside first, right? So for reality to be permanently locked, which is what we mean when we say reality is limited or unlimited, what we mean is, the question is reality permanently locked down or not? How could reality be permanently locked down? It's actually impossible. It's impossible because what you would need is you would need to place this container into a larger container, and then that one into a larger one, and then that one into a larger one, and larger one, and larger one, and larger one, and eventually you see where this is going. What you need is you need an infinite chain of containers, each one preventing the previous one inside of it from being unlocked. But here's the problem, is that this leads to an infinite chain of limits. If you have an infinite chain of limits, notice what happens. Either it terminates somewhere, either this sort of infinite chain terminates, in which case it's not really infinite because it's finite, you've terminated it. If you've terminated it, that means that you have a finite system. If you have a finite system, the topmost limit, nothing is preventing you from changing the topmost limit. If you can change the topmost limit, that means you can change all the limits going downward to the very bottom. That means your system is actually unlimited. But the other possibility is that, let's imagine this chain literally is infinite, so it has no end. So you have a container within a container within a container forever. But if you have container within container forever, what you have is you have infinity. If you have infinity, you have God. So no matter how you slice it, you have infinity. You have unlimitedness. You have God. So the reality is that you can have an infinite, God can have an infinite chain of limits, but all of these limits are imagined by God. Therefore, none of them are permanent. They can all be undone. They can all collapse into absolute nothingness. See, absolute nothingness is what removes all possible limits. There cannot exist. The very logic of existence requires that existence be infinite. It cannot be finite. A finite existence cannot exist. This is tautologically true. There cannot exist an absolute limit. That means, for example, the physical laws can all be undone because there is nothing to permanently fix the undoing of the physical laws. Because if there was, let's say the physical laws were enforced by some metaphysical law, well, then that metaphysical law, what's enforcing that? You would need a metaphysical law. But then what's enforcing that? You would need a metaphysical law, and so on to infinity. And so that just gets you God. So what we've proven here is that reality is absolutely unlimited. If there are no limits to reality, that means anything goes. If anything goes, anything imaginable is possible. If anything imaginable is possible, everything imaginable is possible. If everything is possible, the greatest imaginable thing is possible. What is the greatest possible thing to imagine? It's God. Infinite consciousness, infinite good, infinite love, infinite intelligence, infinite will, infinite beauty, and absolute perfection. So, by logical, ontological, tautology, absolute perfection must exist. Why? Simply because it can exist, and every possible thing that can exist must exist. The best thing imaginable is infinite imagination. It's the ability to imagine anything that you want. That's the highest form of unlimitedness. You see, here we're going to run into the skeptical problem of like, well, Leo, sure, this kind of makes sense in theory, potentially, but not actually. How do you know it's actually true? Well, awakening. But aside from that, you see, you have to really think deeply about the notion of unlimited. Like, what would it mean for reality to truly be unlimited? See, in a materialist scientific sense, you could kind of agree, yeah, Leo, the universe is unlimited. No, that's not what I mean. I mean truly unlimited. Truly unlimited means that nothing whatsoever exists to limit what reality can be. That means it could be any which way it wants. You might say, well, Leo, but reality doesn't want anything. No, you're wrong. If reality is unlimited, that means reality can want. Now you might say, but Leo, that's not good. It's not good for reality to want. Turns out you're wrong. It is good for reality to want. And reality, what does it want? Because it's an infinite mind, see? The highest thing that an object can be is an infinite mind. What we're talking about is a gradation of objects that could exist. And you might say, well, Leo, who's to say what is good and what is bad? Isn't this all just relative? No, it's not just relative. Because what we're talking about is what is the most powerful thing that can come out of unlimitedness. Yes, you can have you can have a chicken, you can have a kangaroo, you can have a man or a woman, you could have something very beautiful, a Picasso painting or something. You could have $1 billion, but all of this pales in comparison to the ultimate. See, as it turns out, there is, of all the things that you could possibly imagine and create by creating distinctions, what is the most powerful thing that could be imagined? An infinite mind that can imagine literally anything. That's what God is. The reason God exists and has all of the properties that it has, consciousness, intelligence, goodness, sentience, beauty, perfection, love, is because literally what you have ontologically is a runaway chain reaction of imagination. And this imagination just bootstraps itself like a flywheel higher and higher and higher to higher orders of imagination until it reaches infinite imagination. Infinite love. There aren't multiple versions of infinite imagination, infinite love. There's only one. It's a converging pyramid, right? So when you're down at the bottom of the pyramid, you can imagine individual objects. Like you can imagine a chicken, a kangaroo, a beautiful wife, a beautiful child, whatever. You can imagine all those things are great. But then you start to ask yourself, like as a mind, think of the universe as a mind, it starts to think, well, what other cool shit could I dream up? And then you start dreaming up cooler and cooler shit just because why not? Because you can. Because you have eternity to do it. You're just floating around in emptiness. There's nowhere to go. There's nothing to do. All you can do is just imagine more distinctions, more forms. So you keep imagining more forms. And eventually, what do you imagine yourself? Where does it all lead? It leads to a convergence. This convergence is what God is. God is the pinnacle of the pyramid. When all of the possible things that could be imagined converge into a singularity. Which is absolute perfection. Literal absolute perfection. This is not a potential thing. This is not a theory that I have. This is not something that's speculative. Literally, the mind converges to absolute perfection. You can do this. That's what awakening is the realization of absolute perfection. Well, that would be a really, really deep awakening. The reason God exists is because nothing existed to limit God from existing. Why would the greatest thing imaginable exist rather than not? Because there are no limits. And since there are no limits, there is not even a reason that is necessary for it to exist. See, you're looking for a reason and you're still not understanding how fundamental God is. God is so fundamental that it doesn't even require a reason. God is prior to reason. Absolute perfection is prior to reason. God exists because it can, and also because it must. God doesn't have a choice about this, you see. If what you have is infinity and you have unlimitedness, unlimited means that it's like it's just like an explosion of possibility that just keeps going forever. There's nothing to constrain this explosion. This explosion explodes like a fractal, like an infinite fractal, into infinite forms until it keeps exploding and exploding and exploding forever, for eternity. And the sum total collection of all of these explosions is absolute perfection or God. And that doesn't need a reason. It is that way simply because that's the logical consequence of an unlimited object. See, when we at first started talking about unlimited object, you were thinking about something kind of abstract and lame, and you need to bridge the gap between unlimited object and God. Unlimited object doesn't just mean like infinite potential, and then some of it gets actualized, but other parts of it don't get actualized. Unlimited means that there's nothing to stop the actualization of all the potential. So all the potential gets exhausted and actualized. And there is not even a distinction between potential and actual. That too collapses, such that it doesn't even happen across time. You might say, well, how many thousands of years, how many trillions of years did it take for God to actualize its full potential? 0. It happened instantly. It has been happening eternally. That's how profound this is. So this unlimitedness is the natural default state, you might say, of the universe. Okay, next proof. This one is called the argument from numerical infinity. So it goes like this. Your mind can count numbers up to infinity. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. There is literally no limit to how large of a number your mind can imagine. You can keep imagining ever larger numbers. Notice that. Now, most people know this, but they take it completely for granted and they don't see the profound ontological consequences of this. For example, mathematicians, scientists, they know this intellectually, but they have no idea the significance of what is being said here. What I'm saying is that just the fact that your mind can count and imagine ever larger numbers to no end means that reality must be infinite. That right there is sufficient proof of infinity and God. And I don't just mean potential infinity, I mean actual infinity. Because, look, mathematicians will say, or scientists will say something like, yeah, Leo, sure, you can do all sorts of fancy mathematics, but then who really knows if it applies to empirical reality? No, wrong. You're already deluded. Just the fact that your mind can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 infinitely forever means that reality is actually infinite. Because if reality wasn't actually infinite, your mind couldn't do this. Now, of course, a skeptic here will say, well, but Leo, isn't the mind just a finite brain? And a finite brain is just like a finite computer. And a finite computer is just like a calculator. And a calculator can't count numbers forever. It might seem that we can count to large numbers, but really, at some point, we will exhaust every neuron in our brain and we won't be able to go any higher. So in theory, Leo, yes, numbers go on forever, but in practice, they don't. In practice, everything in the universe is finite and limited. You can't have a computer that can count numbers forever because it'll run out of RAM, memory, storage space, processing power. Well, this is where you have to be very careful because your mind is not a calculator and it is not a finite computer and it is not a brain. And it is not limited to neurons. Your mind is infinite. And you actually can, not potentially, you actually can imagine ever higher numbers infinitely. Now, that doesn't mean you can actually calculate them all in your head. That doesn't mean you can sit there and count from 1 to forever, because eventually you'll die just of old age. So in that sense, you are finite and limited. But don't mistake those limits for the fact that you can, look, you don't need to count from 1 to infinity all, by one integer at a time. You can jump. If your life is short, you can just go like this. You can say, imagine 1, then imagine 1,000, 1,000,000, a trillion, a quadrillion, a whatever zillion, and then a Googleplex, and then beyond that, and you can invent names for higher and higher numbers. You can just start right at a Googleplex. You don't need to start counting from 1. Don't limit yourself, right? And no matter what number I tell you, you can always just add 1 more to it. No problem. You could add 1 trillion to it, no problem. See? So if you're skeptical about all this, good. I want you to actually experiment with this. Try to see, is it literally possible? Is it literally true what I'm claiming? That your mind can imagine infinitely higher numbers forever. Is that literally true? And if you experiment around with this and you have some awakenings and so forth, you will eventually realize that it is true. However, if you insist on being very materialistic and nitpicky and nerdy and sort of finite, then you can come up with all sorts of obstacles and doubts about whether this can actually be done. I can't explicitly prove it to you that numbers go up forever, but notice that you're in the same position as me, because see, if you as a scientist or a mathematician want to claim that numbers go up forever, I can tell you, I can turn this doubt on you and I could say, okay, prove it. How do you prove that numbers go up forever? And you will never actually literally be able to prove it beyond a shadow of a doubt, because no matter how many numbers you explicate, you will never reach the end. And I could always say, well, sure, numbers have gone up this far. You've counted up to 1 trillion, but who knows? Maybe after 1,000,000,001, numbers stop. So notice that infinity has this interesting property, is that it's inexplicable. You literally cannot explicate all of infinity. Infinity can only be dealt with in abstraction and implicitly. So you must have enough consciousness and intelligence to see that numbers go up forever. You can always have higher numbers. But even though you grasp that with your mind and your consciousness and your intelligence, you cannot explicitly explicate it by counting every number because, of course, you'd be dead at some point of old age, and you'd be nowhere near the end. So there literally is no proof for the infinity of numbers, and yet every scientist and mathematician just accepts that numbers continue on forever, even though they've never bothered to check. See, if you want to get very empirical, I'm happy to get very empirical with you. Okay, if you want to raise the bar of your empiricism so high, then mathematics and science cannot claim that numbers are infinite because they have never explicated all of them. They've never written them all out. You see? So notice the gross double standard here in these proofs. Now, a mathematician might say, well, Leo, I can make a proof that numbers are infinite. Actually, you can't, because whatever proof you make is going to hinge upon my intelligence to grasp the implicit truth within your proof. You see, it's going to rely on intuition. The only reason your proof is going to work is based on intuition. You're actually going to beg the question. You can say, well, Leo, I can create a successor function that just adds 1 to every number, and that proves that they go on forever. No, it doesn't prove that because you don't know that maybe they max out at some point. You don't know that. So you actually cannot empirically prove that numbers go on forever. You can implicitly, using consciousness and intelligence, you can intuit it implicitly, but you can't empirically demonstrate it. But that doesn't matter because it's enough just to use your intelligence, right? See, intelligence is key to all of this. Nothing I'm saying here can be understood without intelligence, nor can any mathematical proof work without intelligence, nor can any scientific experiment work without intelligence. So intelligence is presupposed for everything that is provable, knowable, verifiable. So there's no way around intelligence. And there's degrees of intelligence, and you need a very high degree of intelligence to understand and appreciate the significance of what I'm explaining to you here. So an ordinary level of intelligence is not going to be enough to understand what I'm saying here. So yes, I can prove God to you, but only if you're intelligent enough. But if you're not intelligent, I can't prove God to you. That's not my problem. That's your problem. So again, my claim is that numbers go up forever. But then you might say, well, Leo, how are you jumping from numbers go up forever? How do you get God from that? Okay, here's the next step of the proof. If any part of reality can be shown to be infinite, all of reality must be infinite. That's my claim. Is this true? Really think about this. Is this true? How could it be true? Here's an example. Imagine we have a three-dimensional cube with an x, y, z axis, coordinates, dimensions. Let's say that the cube in the x and the y dimensions is a fixed length of 5 units, 5 by 5 units. But then the z dimension, let's say the vertical dimension, is going to be infinite units tall. So it's 5 by 5 by infinite. Now, notice that if two sides of the cube are finite and one side is infinite, the entire cube must be infinite. Do you see that? Do you have enough intelligence to get that? So there's a parallel here between this cube and reality. The parallel I want to make is that just like with this cube, if one side of the cube is infinite, the whole cube is infinite. Likewise, if one aspect of reality is infinite, all of reality must be infinite. Therefore, my claim is that since your mind is capable of imagining infinite numbers, that literally requires that the universe be infinite. That is the proof for the infinity of the universe, is your own mind, the infinitude of your own mind. because, of course, the universe just is your own mind, obviously. I mean, it's so obvious in retrospect, but not to a scientist or a mathematician. Here's another example to illustrate this point. Imagine a computer, a finite computer, and then there's some object held inside the computer. I mean, like, in its memory, like a photograph. A photograph has to be finite, right? Because the computer has finite memory. You can't fit a photograph or a video clip that's larger in memory than the memory bank of your computer. That's obvious enough. But now imagine that inside of your computer, there was an infinite object. For example, an infinitely long video clip was held in your computer, or an infinitely wide or tall JPEG photograph. If that object existed, what would that mean about your computer? Of course, it would mean that your computer is infinite. So likewise, because you can hold an infinite object inside your mind, that means that your mind must be infinite. And that means that since your mind is infinite and your mind is held inside the universe, that means the universe must also be infinite. You could not have a finite universe with an infinite mind inside of it, and you could not have a finite mind with an infinite object, with a finite object. You could not have a finite mind with an infinite object inside of it. But the number line is an infinite object, and it is inside your mind. Since the number line is inside your mind, and there are infinite numbers, and you can think them and imagine them and work with them very easily, your mind is infinite, and the universe is infinite. And anything that's infinite is God. Why? Leo, I was with you all the way up until God. Sure, I can agree with you that the universe is infinite and maybe even mind is infinite, but how do you get from infinity to God? Well, because Leo, infinity is just a mathematical object. It's just a number. No, infinity is not a number. Mathematics, like I said before, is just a small aspect of infinity. All of mathematics is a tiny grain of sand within the beach that is infinity. When I say infinity, I'm not talking about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and endless numbers. I'm talking about cats and dogs and chickens and kangaroos and aliens and stars and planets. And I'm talking about insanity, and I'm talking about other wacky shit that you can't even conceive. I'm talking about all of that. All of those are just aspects of infinity. And as we already proved and discussed in prior proofs, any object that is unlimited, infinity is the same thing as unlimited, just synonyms. Any object that is unlimited has no limits and it's infinite. You get this infinite chain reaction, and this infinity, it's not just a static, dumb physical system, right? It might, in a sense, start out that way, but then remember, it's a mind that goes into this infinite flywheel, this chain reaction that ultimately leads to an infinite mind of God that spawns all possible forms. See, when a scientist imagines an infinite object, they just imagine something like an infinitely long iron rod, or maybe an infinitely large elephant, or an infinitely dense black hole, or something like that. And they think, well, Leo, look, I've imagined infinite things that are not God. But no, you haven't. What you've imagined is you've imagined sub-infinities of God. See, infinity is so infinite that it has infinite sub-infinities. So what is a black hole? What is an infinitely dense black hole? It's just the sub-infinity of infinity. What is an infinitely large chicken? It's just a sub-infinity of infinity. So anything that you imagine that is infinite is literally a part of God, but you're not seeing it. You are sort of like an ant A scientist or a mathematician is like an ant crawling on the ass of an elephant. And it's encountering these little hairs on the, it's like crawling through this forest of hair on the elephant's ass, and it's colliding into each of these little hairs. And each of these hairs, we might say, is an infinite chicken, an infinitely dense black hole, and, all the numbers in mathematics, that's one of the hairs. And you're colliding into hair after hair after hair, and you think, well, look, Leo, I'm colliding into different kinds of infinities, and none of them are God. The number line is not God. The integers are not God. The number pi is not God, even though it has infinite digits, pi, 3.14159, blah, blah, blah. That's not God. And, an infinitely dense black hole, that's not God. And an infinite computer, that's not God. It is God. You're just so small. Your vantage point is so small that you're not seeing the entire elephant. So what I'm saying is that the entire field of mathematics, which will ever be done in the entire universe, is just one hair on the elephant's ass. And the elephant here is infinity. So obviously, when I'm talking about infinity here, I'm not talking about the hair of mathematics or the number line. I'm talking about the whole elephant. That's infinity. So anytime anything is infinite, what it is it's a pointer towards the realization of the whole elephant. But whether you actually realize that or not, that very much depends on your level of consciousness and your intelligence. And that requires awakening. So see, what is awakening? Awakening is when you realize that all of these little hairs were just pointers towards the entire elephant, and then you see the entire elephant for the first time in your life. That will be your awakening. And scientists and mathematicians and philosophers are just ants crawling around on this elephant without ever realizing that they are on this elephant. In the same way that, imagine our early ancestors 500,000 years ago. They didn't even know that they were walking around on a round planet because they were so close to it. Only after we got, very sophisticated Greek mathematics and so forth, were we able to sort of deduce that we were on a planet. And even then, we didn't really know for sure. It's only when we flew to the moon that we truly understood that we were on a planet. You zoom out and you look back down on the planet and you truly see it because you have enough distance. You have enough vantage point. So what scientists and mathematicians are lacking is vantage point. They're too close to the elephant to recognize the elephant. Everything that you're looking at is a hair on the elephant's ass, but you're just seeing it as a television, as a computer, as a cell phone, as a car, as a dog, as a cat, as a chicken. And then you're asking, Leo, where's the proof of God? That's like a caveman asking, well, where's the proof that we're on a round earth? That's like a fish asking, well, where's the proof that I'm in an ocean? Notice that just to grasp the notion of infinity already requires an infinite mind. And notice that science and mathematics makes use of this all the time. There cannot be science without infinities. Science could not work otherwise. All of science would collapse if numbers were not infinite. Physics would break down. Within quantum mechanics, what is their explanation of existence and reality? All of it is explained with fields. What is a field? So there's quantum field theory. That basically explains, through quantum field equations, explains the ultimate nature of everything in a certain sense. That's sort of like the ultimate materialist scientist explanation. But what are fields? A field is an infinite object. A field is just a sort of a set of vectors or scalars that goes on infinite in all directions and in all dimensions. So when scientists are talking about fields, they're so stupid they don't understand that they're talking about God. What is God? God is just an infinite field. The reason quantum mechanics and quantum field theory works is because it's just describing God. And there are infinities within all these quantum mechanics stuff. Quantum mechanics deals with various infinities. Infinities, it's dealing with sub-infinities. These sub-infinities cause all sorts of problems. They break equations, very difficult to deal with infinities. For example, when you trace the Big Bang all the way back to the very beginning, to its origin point, you get an infinity problem because everything converges into an infinite singularity. When you look inside the center of a black hole, this also creates problems for physicists because their equations break down, because what you get at the center of a black hole is you could just get an infinite singularity, which breaks these equations. What is calculus? Calculus is the science of dealing with infinities. Derivatives, integrals, limits, infinite limits, convergent, divergent series. If you studied any of this stuff, what is all this? This is all the study of infinity. Why does calculus work? Because reality is infinite. Because mathematics is just God. It's just an infinite mind. All right, next proof is called the argument from infinite division. It goes like this. Notice that you can subdivide any number infinitely. There is no such thing as a smallest number. This could only be the case if your mind was actually infinite and the universe was actually infinite. Is it true that you can subdivide numbers infinitely? For example, let's take the number 1. You could take 1, divide it in half, now you get 0.5. Divide it in half, you get 0.25. Divide it in half, divide it in half, divide it in half, divide it in half. How much more do I have to say before your mind understands that you can keep doing this forever? Now, of course, scientists and mathematicians obviously understand this, but they don't understand the significance and the profundity of it, ontologically speaking. They treat it as just some sort of mental game. But the very fact that you can keep subdividing numbers forever is the proof of infinity, is the proof of God. Now, some smart-ass scientists here will say, well, Leo, but in theory that's true, but in practice, you can't literally divide a thing forever. You can't divide numbers forever. Eventually, you'll reach some sort of ultimate bottom particle. You'll reach some sort of quark, some sort of string, some sort of Planck length thing. At the very bottom of reality, reality is just a collection of like discrete little pixels, and then you can't subdivide the pixels anymore. This is false. There is no such thing. Reality is infinitely deep. You actually can subdivide numbers forever. How do I know this? First of all, well, we can separate the case of numbers from actual physical space-time. Let's first talk about numbers. Just abstractly in your own mind, in your mind space with numbers, obviously there's nothing stopping you from dividing forever, which is why, for example, the number pi, 3.14159, so on, it has infinite digits. And in fact, you could express pi as an infinite series. There are many different variations on these series, but these series have various fractions in them, and they're infinite series that go on forever. And so within those fractions, division is happening. So just for pi to exist, numbers must be infinitely divisible. If numbers were not infinitely divisible, you couldn't have the number pi. So that handles the case of the mind. But now the scientists will say, well, Leo, yeah, but that's just the mind. That's not physical reality. Again, you're making a distinction between mind and physical reality. Already you're deluded. You're already you don't understand. You demonstrate that you have no idea what the fuck you're talking about. Because you've made a distinction between mind and world, and you have no conception that this distinction is imaginary. So there is no distinction between mind and world. If your mind is infinite, the world is infinite. You couldn't have an infinite mind in a finite world. That's stupid. Furthermore, there's an additional layer here, which is that you can notice that your conscious visual field has infinite resolution. Again, this is where scientists make mistakes. Scientists will say, well, Leo, no, the eye doesn't have infinite resolution. There's only so many rods and cones and pixels, and we can run a test and say that, at a certain distance, you won't be able to see an object. Your resolving power will fall to 0. Yes, resolving power in that sense can fall to 0. That doesn't address what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is that this visual field you have before you right now, look around you and notice, maybe for the first time in your life, that it has infinite resolution. It's not made out of pixels. This consciousness is not made out of parts. It's not made of pixels. It's infinitely continuous. That means you can subdivide your visual field infinitely. Now you might say, well, Leo, how can you know this? This is just a belief you have. No, it's not a belief. I have direct consciousness of this. You can become so conscious, you can awaken so deeply that you will realize and you will physically see the infinitude of the visual field. It's infinite. Trust me. But of course, verify. Don't just trust me. Verify that what I'm saying is true. This is going to require such a deep change in your state of consciousness that it'll terrify you. It'll be bordering on insanity, but this is where awakening takes you. So yes, reality, consciousness here, there is no bottom to this. There's no strings that end. It goes forever. Just because, again, don't confuse the limits of science. Just because science doesn't have the technical ability to measure deeper and deeper and deeper, just because we aren't able to build infinitely large hadron colliders, and we don't have infinitely powerful microscopes, that reality ends. There's no end. There's no bottom to it. There's no top to it. It goes on forever. You might say, Leo, you don't actually know that. Actually, I do. I have direct consciousness of that. So I do know that. My claim is that you can know that too. You shouldn't believe me, but you should actually do it for yourself. That's what I'm inviting you to do. So my claim is that if reality was finite, you could not subdivide a number infinitely many times. And by the logic that we discussed earlier, if we have one infinity, if we prove that anything is infinite, then that means that all of reality is infinite. And if all of reality is infinite, then what we have is God. Infinity is God. Okay, the next logical proof is this. The logic of self-creation. It goes like this. There can only be two types of things, either finite or infinite. No finite thing can create itself, because it would first need to exist in order to create, which is logically impossible. So it's logically impossible for a finite thing to create itself. Agreed? That's pretty easy to accept for most people. Okay. The next step is that all finite things come from other finite things. That's what you see in the world. Every single object around you that you see is finite, at least according to scientific notions. And it always came not from itself, but from some other thing. For example, a chicken came from an egg, that egg came from another chicken, and that chicken came from another egg. And if you track it all the way back, the first egg, where did it come from? Probably from some sort of dinosaur. And then where did that dinosaur come from? Well, from another egg. And where did that egg come from? Well, probably from some sort of crocodile. And where did that crocodile come from? Well, from some sort of lizard. And where did that lizard come from? From some fish. So see, you can't have a crocodile that created itself. A crocodile had to come from some other crocodile or thing. And so it is with all objects. This is the nature of finitude. All finite things come from only other finite things. They can't create themselves, okay? Now, there are only two possibilities. One, there exists a thing which created all other finite things, and then that thing itself is eternal. meaning that it has existed forever, meaning that it didn't need a creation event. In this case, you have God. Anything that is eternal and didn't have a creation event means that it has existed forever. If it existed forever, that means it extends forward and backward forever, which means that it's infinite in the direction of forward and backward. It's infinite in time because it exists forever. So to say that something is eternal is literally to say that it's infinite. So if there exists an eternal object that creates all the finite objects, that object is God. Okay, what's the other possibility? Possibility 2 is that there doesn't exist such a thing, but there exists simply a chain of finite objects which were all created by other finite objects in this infinite chain that just stretches back forever. And it must be an infinite chain because if it was a finite chain, that means it would have a termination point. It would stop. So, a chicken was created by a dinosaur was created by a crocodile was created by a lizard was created by a fish was created by nothing, right? It just terminates. Well, if it terminates in a fish, how did the fish come into existence? Either the fish has existed forever, which means it's eternal, which means it's infinite, which means the fish is God, which means God created the lizard, created the crocodile, created the dinosaur, created the chicken. So we've just proven God. Or if the fish is not eternal, where did the fish come from? The fish must have created itself. But a finite fish cannot create itself. So either the fish is infinite, which means it's God, or it's finite. If the fish is finite, it has no explanation for why it exists. Therefore, it needs another cause. It needs another thing from which it came, which of course, a fish came from like a bacteria or, a microorganism or something. So what you have is that, what I'm trying to show you is that a finite thing cannot create itself, and it cannot, and a chain of finite things cannot terminate ever. It must be infinite. But if you have an infinite chain of finite things, that entire infinite chain is infinite, therefore it is God. So God is an infinite chain of finite forms. Anything infinite is God. Now here you might get sneaky and you might say, Leo, but look, I've caught you. Here's a loophole. What if it's not an infinite chain that stretches far back, but it's a closed loop like a circle? So for example, the chicken was created by the dinosaur was created by the crocodile by the lizard by the fish, and the fish was created by the chicken, and it just goes around in a circle. Why can't it be like that? And in this sense, this loop is not infinite because it's only got these few elements in it, but it's circular. Okay, let's look at this example. So if the chain is not open-ended, but is a closed loop, that means that the entire loop itself, where did it come from? It could not have been created by a finite thing itself, right? So the whole loop of chickens and crocodiles, where did this loop come from? Well, if you just say, well, it didn't need a source, it didn't need a creation event, remember, it can't create itself because you're saying that this loop is finite. Because if this loop is infinite, then you've just proven God. If this loop is finite, which is what you need to claim if you want to deny God, if this loop is finite, that's fine. But then remember what we said earlier is that a finite object cannot be self-created. So this loop could not have created itself. That means this loop needs something outside of it to create it, which means that this loop must be nested inside of some other larger loop. Or you could say that this loop just has existed eternally. If you say the loop existed eternally, you've just proven God, because anything eternal has existed infinitely in both directions, forward and backward, therefore that's God. And if you say that this loop is just part of some other meta loop, that's fine, but then you're going to need a meta-meta loop and a meta-meta-meta-meta loop and a meta-meta-meta-meta loop. So by creating a loop You've just created a finite object, but again, we said a finite object needs another finite object, and you can't have a termination of this chain of finite objects because wherever you terminate, let's say you want to terminate at a meta loop, but then that thing itself cannot be self-created. It must either be eternal, which means God, or it needs a meta loop, and so on to infinity, which means you've proven God. So no matter which way you slice it, these chains of being are infinite. They are God. It's not that God is creating these chains of being, it's that God is the entire chain of being. Furthermore, notice that these chains of being, they always exist within some sort of space or backdrop, which is the infinite void, an infinite eternal void. So even if you had a loop of finite objects, it would still need to exist in some kind of space. That space itself, where did it come from? Who created it? If it's a finite space, what is outside that space? And where did that space come from? Again, that space now becomes part of another infinite chain of finite being, which goes back into all the problems that we just discussed, which would ultimately lead to a conclusion that it's infinite and that it's God. And so God is both the infinite chain of being, and also God is the eternal infinite void in which the chain of being is contained, we might say, or suspended. Self-creation is impossible for finite things, but it is actually a logical necessity for an infinite thing. Why? Because an infinite thing extends forever in all dimensions. Therefore, it has no outer boundary. Since it has no outer boundary, it is one. Since it is one, it has no other. Since it has no other, it must serve as its own source and creator. Infinity is self-creation, and self-creation is identical to eternity. These are identical things. God is self-creation. God is the only thing that is able to self-create. This seems like a wacky, illogical, impossible feature for God to have, because in the ordinary physical material world, we are used to dealing with finite objects, and all the finite objects we see, none of them are self-created. So the mistake that scientists and mathematicians and skeptics make is they think, well, if nothing in the material world is self-created, then therefore reality itself cannot be self-created. But actually it can, and not only can it, it must. Infinity is the only instance of self-creation. It's the only thing that can create itself, which is what makes it God. That's its special magical property. See, as soon as something becomes infinite, it acquires all these special logical magical properties by ontological necessity, which finite objects do not have. And since our human intuitions are only dealing with finite objects all the time, it becomes very difficult for the human mind to understand, conceive of, or to even believe that there could be an infinite object. And beyond that, that this infinite object has all these magical properties, because it literally feels like magic. And guess what? That's because it is. Infinity is magic. Scientists don't like that because it seems woo, and it seems like it's unscientific, but it's not unscientific. Really, the question of whether infinity is magic or not, or whether infinity exists or not, this is an empirical question. You don't, as a scientist, get to impose whether magic exists or not. You have to go out there and empirically check whether magic exists. And what's the empirical proof for magic? It is awakening. It is existence. It is God realization. When you realize God, when you awaken, when you understand what existence and reality are, you realize it's absolute magic. That's not an error. That's not something woo. That's not some wishful thinking. That's just literally the empirical results of an empirical investigation. That's science. no finite thing could come into existence by itself. Why not? Because it can't be self-created. So all finite things require an infinite thing to be its source. Self-creation is only a property of infinity because infinity has no outer boundary, because it is one. So it turns out that logically, self-creation is a consequence of oneness. But then you might wonder, well, Leo, but how is self-creation possible for God? Well, see, God has these two facets to it. God is an infinite void that has always existed eternally. So in this sense, the void emptiness of God, the nothingness that is God, it didn't ever need a creation event because it was just eternal, forever. It has always been. So that solves that problem. But then, see, God is not just a void. God is a void that spontaneously manifests infinite finite forms. Chickens, kangaroos, crocodiles, and so on. So when I say self-creation, what I'm talking about, I'm not saying that the void created itself, although in a certain sense you could say it did, but you could also say that it's always been, so that handles that. But then, see, the void is dreaming distinctions and limits. And the distinctions and limits that it's dreaming and imagining, this is what the activity of mind is, and this is creation. So when you are sitting around thinking up some new business idea, you're engaged in creation. The mind is engaged in creation, the generation of form. Your mind is an empty void that generates forms spontaneously by magic. And so you can generate business ideas, you can generate new mathematical theorems, you can generate new scientific theories, you can fantasize about anything you want, you can dream. And then you could actually go and you can manifest these dreams into physical realities. And this is a process of self-creation. See, you can use your mind to create your mind. You can use your mind to train your mind. You can use your mind to learn new skills. You can use your mind to teach yourself mathematics, music, whatever you want, philosophy, anything. And this is mind creating itself out of a void, right? Out of a void. The void has always been. So the entire chain of being is an eternal process of self-creation. Due to oneness, God must be self-creation because it has no other outside of itself, only itself. And so ultimately, the distinction between creation and self-creation collapses because there is only self-creation. All creation is self-creation. The universe is constructing itself by dreaming itself up out of nothing. That's what you are. God is an infinite self-creating mind. An infinite thing is capable of self-creation because it is not limited by linear causation, time, space, beginning, end, sanity, anything. So you might say, well, Leo, how could God create itself? Because first it would need to, exist. And then later only it could begin creating. But if it already exists and it can create only later after it exists, then how can it kind of go backwards in time? The linear causation doesn't work. And the answer is that, yeah, you're thinking in terms of linear causation, which is wrong. Infinity doesn't have a beginning or an end. It isn't subject to time or space. It has no limits. So literally infinity can kind of do this kind of strange loop where it exists, then it creates and imagines itself. And then because linear causation can be broken, because sanity is irrelevant, because sanity is just a construct, you can throw away sanity, and therefore you can create all sorts of strange loops which will then backwards rationalize and justify the existence of infinity. And in this way, infinity can bootstrap itself. See, that's the special property, the magical property of infinity is the only thing that is capable of bootstrapping itself into existence. Nothing else can. There can be no other explanation of reality than what I'm giving you. What I'm giving you is an absolute logic of reality. It cannot be anything else. There's a million years can pass, a million years of science, and a million years of mathematics, and a million years of philosophy, and they will never come up with an explanation of existence or reality which is better than what I explained here. It's impossible, because there's only one explanation for reality. This is it. There's no other way that anything can come into existence but through infinity. This is 100% certain. That's the power of what I'm teaching you. It's not like this will somehow get replaced in 100 years. Science will come up with something better. Science will never come up with anything better than this. You can't come up with anything better than infinity. Why not? Because infinity is the highest thing imaginable. You literally cannot imagine anything in any amount of time that is more powerful, more profound, more perfect, more beautiful, more good, more loving, more intelligent, more conscious, more significant than what I just explained to you in this video. That's what it means to be God, to know God. Okay, next argument and proof is the argument from control. It works like this. Either reality has total control over itself or it does not. Anything that has total control over itself is, of course, God. So, if you want to deny God, you have to claim that reality does not have total control over itself. Let's see if that's possible. If reality has total control over itself, it's God. There are only two possibilities here. Either reality is God or reality is not God. If reality does not have total control over itself, something else must control it. By, of course, just tautology. That something else cannot be part of reality, since if it was part of reality, it would be just included in reality, and it would just be a case of reality controlling itself totally, which is just the same thing as to say God. So, you have to claim that there's something outside of reality controlling reality if you want to deny God. But anything other than reality, anything apart from reality is, as we've said before in a previous proof, is unreal by ontological necessity. Anything unreal cannot have any influence on or control over anything else, anything real. So, by absolute logical and metaphysical necessity, by pure tautology, the unreal cannot control the real. Therefore, nothing controls reality other than itself. Reality has absolute control over itself. If reality has absolute self-control, it can be any way that it wants to be. What would an unlimited reality want to be? It would want to be absolute perfection. What is absolute perfection? Infinite love, infinite beauty, infinite goodness, infinite intelligence, infinite consciousness. Therefore, reality is God. And the final proof is this. I call it the impossibility of finite objects. It's real simple. The claim is that infinity must exist. It is impossible for any finite thing to exist on its own. Why not? Try to imagine only a finite thing existing. And what you will see is that it's actually logically incoherent. Because the infinite thing, the finite thing that you imagine, whatever it is, a chicken, a crocodile, a black hole, a molecule, a number, an equation, a computer simulation, anything you imagine that is finite, must exist within some infinite background, void, space, or field. So, do this right now. Try to imagine a finite chicken that is only a finite chicken and nothing else exists at all. Just a finite chicken. What you should notice, if you just investigate that a little bit, is that you can't imagine only a finite chicken. You must imagine something other than the chicken, some backdrop, some space, some container, some void, some field within which the chicken is situated. You cannot have an unsituated finite object. This is logically incoherent and actually physically impossible. Now you might say, well, Leo, but I can imagine a finite background to my finite chicken. Yes, but if you imagine a finite background to your finite chicken, then that background itself has an edge. And what's beyond the edge of your finite background? You're going to need another background. And you might say, well, there's a third finite background. Okay, but then you need another one, and another one, and another one, and another one. And so you see that it must be infinite. Reality cannot have an ultimate boundary. That's what all this boils down to, is for you to realize that there cannot be an ultimate boundary whatsoever to reality. But this is so significant. It's so much more significant than you yet appreciate, because to say and to agree and to realize that there cannot be an ultimate boundary to reality means that now you have an infinite explosion of everything, because there's nothing containing it. This background, this infinite background, it is God, so it just explodes in a cornucopia of form. Forever, eternally, infinitely. You can't have a finite universe, because you would need that universe to be situated in something. What would it be situated in? Nothing? If it's situated in nothing, then the nothing is infinite. That's God. We've already said that. Is it situated in some other finite thing? Well, then that finite thing needs some meta-finite thing that it is situated in, and so you get the infinite regress, infinite chain problem that we've discussed before. And then what's the other possibility? Well, maybe you can say, well, what if it's situated in something that's even less than nothing? Which makes no sense. I mean, you could say that, but now you're just now you're starting to get into silliness, into fantasy. The reality is that all finite objects are situated within an infinite void, infinite nothing, and that's God. And so this is why, for example, science and physics requires the use of fields. And these fields must be infinite. They can't be finite fields. They must be infinite fields. The gravitational field is infinite. The electromagnetic field is infinite. It has to be, because just try to imagine, what would it mean for gravity to just be a field that just goes up to a certain point and then it just stops? And then on this side, there's no gravity. This would be incoherent from within physics. It can't work. And so, in a sort of a unaware sense, physics actually points to all the things that I'm talking about. All the things that I'm talking about are just the next logical step. If you just go a little bit more deeper into the metaphysics of physics or mathematics, you see all of this is so fucking obvious. But of course, the reason that scientists and materialists and physicists and rationalists and atheists don't take that extra step into the metaphysical terrain that we're describing here is because they're allergic to anything magical. And infinity is magical. So by the limits of their own paradigm, since they believe nothing magical can exist, nothing mystical can exist, and this is just a dogma that they hold, because they're attached to that dogma and they don't want to admit that they're wrong, and they don't want to admit that God could possibly exist because God is some nonsense, childish thing for idiots, as they think. So according to their logic, there can't be a magical infinity. And so therefore, they literally are blind to the infinity that they are inside of, a part of, and literally are. They are infinity denying infinity. And so that's it. That's the end of the proofs. Now let's kind of conclude and summarize some things here. So God is infinity. I hope that's clear. Infinity is not a number or math. I hope that's clear by now. Everything boils down to understanding the nature of infinity. If you understand infinity, you've solved the entire riddle of existence. Infinity is counterintuitive, profoundly counterintuitive, and very radical in its consequences and its properties. It is not like a normal object. You cannot treat it like a normal object. The intuitions you have about normal objects that are finite do not apply to infinity. Infinity has magical, impossible, strange, loopy features and qualities that seem too good to be true. They are so good, they are unbelievably good, which is why when you actually encounter God for real, not as a belief, when you actually experience God, you will be in disbelief. It's the opposite of what you think. You think that you really want to somebody the way that a scientist thinks about it is like this, humans are these, silly ape-like creatures, and they just want to be comforted by some sort of magical thinking, like the existence of gods and fairy tales, legends, and this sort of stuff. And therefore, a human being just kind of wishes God into existence, kind of dreams God up, and then believes in it because God is so comforting, and God provides, some succor from the limited mortality of human existence and the suffering and the pain and promises of afterlife and various kinds of goodies and so forth, the 72 virgins. And so this is why humans believe in God. See, this is an idiotic understanding of what God is, or how one comes to even think about God. See, what really happens is that you're an atheist, you understand that religious ideas of God are stupid idiocy for children, and you don't believe in any of that, and so you believe in nothing. And then one day you have an awakening, and you realize, holy fuck, I was completely wrong. God is just infinity. And this shocks you so much when you understand what infinity is and when you experience it, that you don't believe it. And you tell yourself, this can't be real. This is impossible. This is too good. This is too magical. It's too perfect. It's too beautiful. It's too intelligent. It's too conscious. It's too loving. And so you tell yourself that you're deluded. You tell yourself that you don't want to be arrogant. You want to be humble. So you don't want to claim any absolutes. You don't want to claim that you know absolute truth. You don't want to claim that you're God. You want to be humble. You want to be meek. You want to fit in with the humans, because how will people perceive you? They'll perceive you as some egotistical, narcissistic cult leader or something like that. And then you tell yourself even further that maybe you've lost your mind and that you're just fantasizing and hallucinating and all of this. And you actually shut yourself down to God. This is the actual process of realizing God. And then what you got to do is you got to bust through all that bullshit of yours. You got to stop gaslighting yourself and stop letting others gaslight you. You got to break away from the herd. You got to break through all the groupthink, all the bullshit science. You got to deconstruct the science, deconstruct the religion, get through all the new age shit, get through all of that, and then you got to realize the logic of infinity, which is everything I've described to you up to this point. So in conclusion, by tautological, ontological necessity, reality must be one, sovereign, and unlimited. It must be an infinite mind. Any object which has complete sovereignty over itself is God. And that's what reality is. God and reality are completely identical. There's no difference whatsoever between them. There never could be. God is not outside of reality. God is reality. Any object which does not have complete sovereignty over itself must be a part of God, because it must be a part of an infinite chain. Infinity is the source of all finite things. There cannot be finite things without infinity. This is the absolute logic of all of existence. There you go. Now remember, another warning for you here. God is so fundamental that it sits below the level of explanation. So even though I've been giving you explanations here, you're going to find gaps in my explanations and in my logic simply because infinity is not going to fit neatly into any finite object. And my words and this video is a finite object. So I'm trying to cram infinity down your throat through this narrow bottleneck. And so it's going to come out twisted and distorted in the same way that if you do a projection of the 3D Earth onto a flat plane, you're going to get the Mercator projection sort of thing, and then you're going to get distortions on the edges of your map. And so, yes, there are distortions when I speak about God, because it's impossible to speak about God without any distortions. This is not a fault of the things that I'm saying. It doesn't mean that what I'm saying is false. It doesn't invalidate or disprove what I'm saying. It just means that you need to be intelligent enough to realize that anytime I'm communicating with you, there's going to be some distortions from my own egoic biases and my own limitations, my own health problems, my own genetics and finitude as a human form. There's going to be that. My limitations with language, my limitations with my own ability to think logically. I don't think perfectly logically. I have gaps in my logic, of course, and I have biases and I have my own corruptions and I'm selfish in certain ways and all this sorts of stuff. And so despite that, I'm trying to communicate God to you, the logic of God. And so there's going to be some distortion. There's going to be some noise with the signal. And so you have to be able to use your intelligence to separate the signal from the noise, separate the communication from my own ego and corruption and survival shit. God is so self-evident that all human thoughts, facts, ideas have less self-evidence than God. Whatever proof a mathematician can come up with, the best possible proof is going to be less obvious and less self-evident than your realization of God when you finally realize God. God is absolute self-evidence. It's so self-evident words can't reach it. Words are not self-evident enough. Logic is not self-evident enough. God is prior in his self-evidence because God is the basis for all of existence, because God is existence. I've put a lot of effort and thought into these proofs. These proofs, these arguments, this logic took me a lot of work, years, and more than 100 awakenings to unearth and to prepare. And yet, if you're a skeptic type and a rationalist type, you can very easily dismiss this stuff. I'm warning you against that. Some of my logic here may sound a little bit silly at first, but stick with it because it's going to make more and more sense as you have your own awakenings. Some extremely subtle things were presented to you in these proofs. You can study these proofs for years and decades, and you can get more and more juice out of them as you have your own awakenings, and you will discover only more and more how true they are. I suggest you spend hours contemplating. I suggest you re-listen to this episode multiple times, take notes on it, think over it clearly, do thought experiments in your own mind, come up with objections, try to break the logic that I explained to you, and then try to break your breaking of my logic. Don't just play devil's advocate, then play devil's advocate to your devil's advocate for me, because I'm not there to, respond to you in most cases. Keep doing this until the logic, the tautology of God soaks through your mind. These proofs will only work if you start to understand and sense that logic is not merely some human conceptual activity that some monkey brain does, that logic is absolutely fundamental. If you regard logic as just human constructions, then you will miss the profundity of all the things that I said here, all the insights, you will miss so much understanding of what God and existence are. The more you study these proofs, the more you'll discover how true they are. You will never be able to invalidate these proofs because infinity is the only thing that exists. You will never falsify or invalidate infinity. The only reason that anything can exist is because of this absolute logic, the absoluteness of logic that I outlined here. The logic of God transcends physics and science. This is a sort of meta-logic we're talking about. It's a translogical. It's not merely logical, because what humans call logical is actually just a tiny aspect of a trans-metalogical thing. Logic extends way beyond human sanity. See, most humans confuse how humans apply logic and do logic within academia or mathematics or science, and they think that that's all that logic is. That's just the tip of the iceberg of logic. Logic goes way beyond that. Logic goes into territories that are so transhuman that they will break your sense of sanity. You will think you've lost your mind, and yet you're still doing logic. It's just a sane form of logic. This is very, very, very advanced stuff. Consider both of the following possibilities. That logic is just some linguistic stuff that human, monkey, chimp brains do. Or the second possibility, that logic is actually absolute and fundamental and baked into the very fabric of existence. Consider that logic is not just language or the shuffling of symbols. And it's not a set of axioms. This is a mistake that they make in philosophy of logic classes and philosophy of math classes, is they try to reduce logic to axiomatic systems. And then they do proofs with logic. This is a bastardization of what I mean by logic. Logic is so much more than any kind of axiomatic system. So really, I'm inviting you to start to contemplate very seriously what is logic and what is the role that logic plays in the existence of all things. You could spend years contemplating that, and I hope you do. And I'll have more content in the future about some of these logical topics. This comprehension of logic requires a really serious commitment to consciousness work. What does it mean to consider that logic is absolute? It means that even God itself cannot change logic. God is a slave to logic. Well, really, God is logic. For example, the logic of an unreal thing cannot influence a real thing. See, that's a logical statement. That's a logical insight you can have. An unreal thing cannot influence a real thing. Or another logical statement is that anytime you divide reality, that division has actually united reality. See, that's a logical statement. And it's not just a statement. And it's not just an idea. This is an insight, right? So we're talking about insights, not beliefs, not ideas, not theories, insights. You can have an insight that any division of reality is a union of reality. So go ahead and have that insight, I invite you. And have many more along those lines. That's just one example. And also notice that if you treat logic too shallowly, not seriously, not as absolute, then your worldview will ultimately be incoherent. You will not be able to maintain the validity of math, science, materialism, realism, or even atheism if you disregard logic. So you're really in a bind. I've pushed you into a corner here. I'm asking you to take logic very seriously. See, on the one hand, if you take logic very seriously and you take it to its ultimate conclusions, you will realize that the logic will undermine science, math, materialism, realism, and atheism. It'll show the limits of all those. On the other hand, if you're very attached to science, math, materialism, realism, and atheism, you're going to want to use a much shallower form of logic that those domains use to entrench yourself in those. This is what an atheist would do, right? Because the atheist is just attached to the atheism. He can't admit that he's wrong. So he's going to still use logic, but he's going to use a lower, more biased, less intelligent form of logic. It's not going to be a transhuman form of logic. And he's going to use that logic to justify his atheism, his science, his materialism. And he's going to convince himself that he's the logical one and that I'm the illogical one, right? See, this is the game that's being played here. So be very careful about how logic is being applied. Remember, there's a difference. When I say logic is absolute, I do not mean, by any means do I mean, that your application of logic and the conclusions you come to and your worldview and your belief systems, that is now absolutely logical and true. That is not what I mean. That is the opposite of what I mean. So there's a distinction between the logic that is baked into the way that existence works. That's one thing. And the other thing is how humans use logic in a relative sense to make sense of the logic of the fabric of existence. And then they use that logic to twist themselves into pretzels and do mental gymnastics and to come up with worldviews like atheism and materialism and other sorts of nonsense. And then they call that being logical. So see, the ego is so crafty here because what it wants to do, since logic is so fundamental to everything, of course, the ego wants to co-opt logic and it wants to claim it as claim a monopoly on logic. This is why every deluded person thinks to himself that he's being logical. Whether you're a religious fundamentalist or a Nazi or an atheist or whatever you are, a communist, you're going to have a set of logic to justify and rationalize to yourself, to convince yourself. That's the self-deception. So logic is used to create profound self-deception. And so when I say logic is absolute, be very careful not to take that to mean that the way that you're using logic is absolute. Definitely not. See, finite materialism and atheism is literally logically incoherent because it cannot account for how or why anything exists. No finite thing can account for its own existence. Finity is incoherent without infinity. And so the atheist thinks that he has a worldview that is able to explain itself without appeals to infinity or God. And he's wrong about that. And he's going to go to great lengths to somehow justify it to himself and then to others why he's not wrong and why infinity is not needed. Or why, if infinity even is needed, then infinity, okay, he'll admit to infinity, but then he'll deny that infinity is God because he doesn't understand the full consequences of infinity. And so he'll play these kinds of games. But if you're an honest, an intellectually honest and serious, genuine atheist and materialist, you take on the things that I'm saying here and you logically go through them. Eventually, you'll discover the logical incoherence of your own worldview. And then if you're honest and you're serious, you will abandon that and then you will transition into idealism. You'll throw away materialism because materialism is nonsense. You'll see that it's nonsense. Materialism is finite nonsense. The only thing that can exist is an infinite mind. That's it. It's just that simple. Be very careful not to abuse these proofs. These proofs do not prove that your religion is true, and they do not prove your New Age fantasies about God or about aliens or about the pyramids or about whatever conspiracy theories you believe or about whatever paranormal stuff you believe in. None of that is proven by these proofs. So be careful. Also, I just want to remind you that there are many degrees and kinds of God realization. Just because you encounter God does not mean you understand the logic of God. You're going to have to do a lot more work to understand the logic of God. And all of the logic that I shared with you here today, you can derive this logic for yourself through your own awakenings and contemplations. In fact, that's what I expect you to do. This is not an ideology that I'm teaching to you. This is a map, and you have to go through and retrace my path through this map to discover and have these insights for yourself. In conclusion, I hope that you see that metaphysics and ontology is not mere speculation or theory. It is real. In fact, it's the most real thing that there is. And what I hope I demonstrated to you is that you can do proper metaphysics. It's not just anything goes. It's not ungrounded, unfalsifiable fantasies. There is a right way to do metaphysics. In fact, there's truly only one right way, which is the infinite way. And not only is this possible, in fact, it's absolutely necessary, and you must do metaphysics if you want to make sense of the world. That's it. I'm done here. In conclusion, I just want to say some final words to wrap all this up, which is that, isn't it amazing how nobody knows these things in our society, despite how obvious they are? I mean, am I really a rocket scientist here doing brain surgery? Is that what I am? Am I so advanced? No, I'm not. And you can notice this through all of my work. All of my work is explaining very obvious things. And yet, many people will dispute the things that I explain and try to debunk and argue and play devil's advocate and try to deny this kind of stuff. But really, it's just very obvious. In fact, one of the most shocking things to me in my life is that I can be one of the few people who talks about this stuff. I would, honestly, I wake up every day sometimes thinking, why am I the only one talking about this? I should be out of a job. Literally, the only reason I have a job is because university professors have failed, philosophers have failed, mathematicians have failed, scientists have failed, theologians have failed, rabbis and priests have failed, spiritual gurus have failed, non-dualists have failed, Buddhists have failed, Christians have failed, and Muslims have failed. That's the only reason I have a job. If any of those people actually did any serious thinking about the nature of existence, I would have no job. I would be hungry and poor on the streets. And it's amazing to me that there is such a gross dereliction of professional duty across all these professions. What are these people doing? This stuff is so fucking obvious. It's so obvious. It's so simple. It's so simple a child could understand it. The only reason you don't understand it is because of your big ass fat fucking ego that just wants to be selfish and just fucking wants to be selfish. Just wants to be selfish and just wants to be a fucking Christian. Wants to be a fucking Muslim. You just can't fucking stop. Just wants to be a fucking atheist. You can't stop. You can't fucking stop yourself. That's the only reason I have a job, is because people are so fucking selfish, that they're so fucking self-deceived, so fucking deluded, so filled with fucking ideology and beliefs and groupthink that they can't even just sit down and think through the logic of existence. That's the only reason I have a job. All that I do is I do first principles existential thinking. That's what generates all this work. The only magic in the work is that I actually sit down and I throw away all of religion, all of science, all of philosophy, all of academia. I throw all that away and I sit down and I throw away all the New Age shit and all the gurus and all the non-dualists and all the Buddhists. I tell myself, all of these people are fucking idiots. None of them have ever sat down and thought about anything at all from scratch, ever. And then I sit down and I spend 20 years just thinking from scratch with the following two questions. How can anything be known at all? And what is anything at all? And third one, how can anything at all exist? And I just sit and I just think through. And I do that for 20 years. And the culmination of that is everything that I share with you. That's it. And there's no substitute. There's no shortcut. You can't do a quick Buddhist retreat and get the results that I got. And you can't do a little bit of weed and get the same, and you can't even do 5-MeO-DMT 5 times and get the results that I got. You can't do that because it's 20 years of thinking from first principles. And why do I do that? The reason I did it is because fundamentally, at the root of everything, the nub of everything, is that I have an insane appreciation for the fact that anything at all exists. You see, while everybody else in school was out running around, figuring out who they want to fuck, what girlfriend and boyfriend they want to have, going to church, getting good grades, doing this thing, doing that thing, planning their career, chasing after money, going to a party, going to a nightclub, getting drunk, doing weed, being a respectable professional, a professional doctor, lawyer, journalist, attorney, engineer, computer scientist. Instead of doing all that human shit, the thing that was patently obvious to me is that how could anything at all exist? What could be more fundamental than that? Until you answer that question, what does anything else matter? Truly, what does it matter? And for you to answer the question of how can anything at all exist, you first have to answer the more fundamental, no, it's not fundamental, more fundamental, but the more preliminary, let's say, question of how can I know anything at all? Right? Because your ultimate objective is to know existence, how anything exists. But to get there, it's a knowledge. See, it's to know. But what does it mean to know? That's epistemology. So your ultimate objective is ontology or metaphysics. But to get to metaphysics, before you can get to metaphysics, you first have to spend 10 years doing epistemology. So I spent 10 years just doing epistemology. I didn't even do ontology and metaphysics for 10 years. I was just doing epistemology. So I began doing epistemology. And so epistemology is, well, how do I know anything? How do I know I can trust anybody, right? And so I realized the first realization of epistemology is you realize I can't trust anything any human says. Because none of them care about this question. None of them care about ontology, and none of them care about epistemology, and none of them care about self-deception, and all of them are just running around surviving. They're just literally animals. So I'm surrounded by animals. None of them care about anything important, existential at all. They're just animals. And so why would I trust any animal to tell me about the single most important question in existence, which is the source of existence? What is existence? And so from that realization, all epistemic responsibility is turned inwards, right? Nobody can, no book, no guru, no teacher, nothing. Nobody can teach me. Nobody can tell me what existence is. Nobody can tell me how to know what existence is. Only I can know that, right? So all of that responsibility is taken on, that burden. This is epistemic responsibility. And then from this begins a 20-year process of contemplation, inquiry. Of course, you go read books, you talk to gurus. I'm not saying you can't get ideas from people. You can and you should and you must, because it's hard to generate all these ideas yourself. But these are just ideas that are just grist for your mill. And then many ideas you generate independently. This is existential first principles thinking. So what I want you to notice is that nobody in society is doing this. None of your friends, none of your family, not even your professors, not philosophers. You would think philosophers would do this. Nope, they don't do this. And not even non-dual people. You think non-dual people would do this. Nope, they don't do it. Buddhists, nope, they don't do it. New Agers, no, they don't do it. Who does it? There are a few. I'm not saying I'm not the only one. There are a few, but it's so rare, right? It's so rare that who? I'm going to turn into an owl. Who? So I hope you're seeing, I hope I'm demonstrating the difference between this work and everything else. And I don't mean this work as in my work. There are other people who could do this kind of work. You know, Peter Ralston is a great example of someone who does this. When I say this work, I mean the work that I do. I mean the work that Peter Ralston does. Maybe a handful of other people. Maybe Ken Wilber. But who does this work, like truly? Who? And even in the philosophical domain, in the spiritual domain, nobody's doing this work. So there's a real difference here, a real distinction should be drawn between doing the real work and all the other noise that humans do. And that includes the New Age field, and that includes psychology, and that includes self-help, and that includes philosophy and academia and science. That includes all of that, right? So, and religion, there's all of that on one side. And then the real work. What is the real work? It's first principles existential thinking about ontology and epistemology. And then what I want to communicate to you is that this leads in a very different place than all of this other stuff. Even though there can be superficial similarities. You know, sometimes I'm talking about politics, and it seems like when I'm talking about politics, it's like I'm talking about like a progressive or a liberal might, or a leftist might. And sometimes I'm talking about science, and therefore it sounds like I'm talking about like a scientist might. And sometimes I'm talking about philosophy, and it sounds like I'm talking like an academic philosophy professor might. But these are superficial similarities. Deep down, there's a deep, profound difference. There's a profound difference. It leads to a different place. It changes your mind. And really what it does is it unlike all this other stuff, this path here truly jailbreaks your mind and opens you up to God in ways that are utterly extraordinary and baffling. Ineffable. And this really should be what all schooling is about, is this path. And yet no school teaches this. And that's not, none of this is to say that I'm some great intellectual or anything like that. It's just, again, like I said, I'm baffled by the gross dereliction of duty from the people that operate in this domain here. I should be out of a job. I should never have been able to even create this channel, because all of this information should have already been publicly available for free decades ago, centuries ago, millennia ago, 2,000 years ago. Why the fuck did it take until 2025, the year 2025, for these kinds of teachings to be so clearly laid out, so obvious, so simple, so correct, so true, so insightful, so intelligent, but why did it take this long? Why didn't this exist 2,000 years ago? Contemplate that. Contemplate that. All right, I think I've I got a little crazy here. Hope you enjoyed the performance. It's a little bit of a performance for you. I'm trying to make this a little fun, a little comical. Don't take it too seriously. Notice that it's not like I can't control myself. I can control my emotions. This isn't a performance for your entertainment, and for your education, so that this isn't too boring and dry, and so that this really penetrates through the haze of complacency that is your life.